like to start with a very rough sketch. I'm going to paint over a lot of the details, so I just want a vague outline of where everything should be. When I create the initial sketches, I don't want to just copy a particular reference. I will use reference images and reference videos, but I will not just copy one particular image. If you'd like me to talk about my initial sketching process, how I use those images to collate them and create a final image that is unique, let me know in the comments, and it's a video I'll look at doing in the future. You can see me swatching a lot of different brushes. I don't have a favourite brush that I use for most pieces. I approach each piece completely different. So I went in looking at the brushes and ended up using the stucco brush. I enjoyed the texture of this one. I liked that it was non-uniform in its edges and in its pressure, and it blended really in really unusual ways. I enjoyed the way that it laid onto the piece, so that's how I decided on this. The pencil that I use for the outline and later that I use again to work in the detail on the face is just the peppermint pencil in the sketching tab, and that's in black and tones of grey. You'll see me reach for this a few times throughout because obviously as I'm painting over I'm losing some of the initial detail, and there's certain areas that I want to retain quite a lot of detail, so I will re-sketch those. And in doing that, in adding more depth to certain areas, you'll then see where you require more light and more dark, and that's how the process goes. You are layering. I would recommend that you do this in layers because Procreate has that option. It makes it much easier if you add a layer that then becomes unnecessary, or if you add a layer of shadow that then you think is too heavy, you can change the opacity without having to completely undo it. So I would recommend that once you get an overall view of the image, go onto a new layer. Use this layer for your lines, then new layer for your shadows, new layer for your highlights. Work it that way. It makes it much easier for yourself. That's what I did at this point. I added a new layer because I was about to begin work on the face. I spent a lot of time on this part. It's very important for any piece. Obviously the face is a focal point. This is a very cute animal as well, so I wanted to capture a great character, so I did spend some time on this part. In adding more detail to the face, it then became apparent on the body where needed more shadow and more light, so I went over again. I'm still using the stucco brush. I did alter the size of the brush to get finer details in the creases of the body, but I kept the same brush throughout, and I'm just adding in patches of white on the side where the light would be coming from and patches of dark for the shadow. I did also rework the fin that is closest to the viewer. The distant fin I didn't mind at all. I added in a quick shadow and a harsh line, and that was the effect that I wanted, and I was happy and moved on from that. The other fin, it's more of a focal point because it's right in the centre of the piece. I did struggle and spend some time on this because I didn't have any clear references of a fin like this in this position against the body, but I did have a general overall understanding of the anatomy of the fin because of the research that I did beforehand, so I was able to sort of come up with the general shape and then put in the shadows as they would naturally lie on the body. You can see me adding thick sweeps with the brush and erasing them to the edge of the piece. This was quite early on in my Procreate process. I was not aware of masks at this point. Obviously, creating a mask of the general shape of your animal is going to be much easier. Again, if this is a video that you think would be helpful, I'd be happy to make that. Just leave me a comment below. You'll frequently see flashes of light as it progresses through. That's just me adding more and more light to the piece. The more detail you put in, the more it becomes apparent where you need to put extra bits of light to make the piece balanced. It's all about creating balance. Add some layers, add some detail, and then add some light and dark to balance it throughout. As I moved down the figure, picking out areas of detail, I was initially going to leave the tail quite abstract as it would be further away from the viewer, but I did think it would be a shame when there's so much detail on the face and the flipper, so I did go in again with the stucco brush to add some depth. I did make it smaller to add detail in the folds of the tail. I'm not looking at reference images at this point. I've got a general understanding of the tail, and it's just about using that anatomy, how it would play with the light and the dark, and just creating an idea of the part of the body, not a definitive copy. One of the things that I like to do when I'm nearing the end of a piece is to actually squint and look at the picture. This way you're looking at general shapes, light and dark, rather than the detail, and this can help pick out areas that are not balanced. When I did this, I saw that there was a dark patch on the face and the fins, but the bottom half was quite washy. So I then added a dark shadow onto the tail so that we then had darkness in the face, across the middle and at the bottom of the image, again creating balance. The piece felt almost complete at this point, so I did power down the iPad, put it away for a few days. There was something missing and I wasn't sure what it was, so oftentimes I will put the piece away and look at it with fresh eyes. When I did that, I realised it was a really obvious thing that was missing. I hadn't included the spots. Luckily for me, Procreate 5 has some great little tools for this, so I used the Waters tab in brushes, and there's splashes and splotches, and I basically did a whole panel of those and then started to remove them where the light would be, where they would be less visible. Any areas of dark skin, I would really bring them out. I used the eraser to fade them in the areas of light, and I turned up the opacity where I wanted them to be darker. Again, I did all these on separate layers so that they were easy to remove and fade out if needed be. I also played with the distort and warp function. It allowed me to get different shapes. Although they're just sort of oval splotches, it allowed me to pull them and shape them, make some patches of them larger, some of them smaller. It just gave me a bigger variety, so it wasn't a uniform pattern, because obviously in nature it's not uniform. The distort and warp functions are actually at the bottom. When you select a layer at the top, you'll have the 4 options along the bottom. You usually keep it uniform to stretch things in and out while keeping the dimensions, but there are warp and distort where you can pull different corners, different pieces of it to change the shape within the entire layer. If these functions are fairly new to you and you think it's something you'd like me to go into depth about, let me know in the comments. It's another video I can look at doing for you guys. Again, with the layers of the spots, it would have been much more helpful if I had created the mask. That's something that I would absolutely do now, but again, at the time wasn't aware of, so I was happy to put on the layers, tidy up the edges, put on a new layer, tidy up the edges. It's definitely a longer way of doing it, but I did enjoy the process. Because I got the largest of the iPads, I'm allowed to use quite a lot of layers, so just in the dots alone I probably used 9 or 10 layers. I just find it easier because if I do something and I want to remove it later, I'll often flick back and forth with it on, with it off, to try and get a gauge of, is this helping, is this adding anything to it? This becomes particularly apparent when I've been drawing for quite some time. I start to lose my momentum and I find that I'm going over the same things over and over. If I'm doing this, if I've been tabbing one layer on and off for more than 10 minutes, I'll realise it's time to call it a day and I will shut everything down. It's often better to just give it a rest, come back with fresh eyes. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. There's obviously a lot of things I could have done to make the process easier for myself, which I now know after learning Procreate. It's all a learning process and you will learn as you go through, but there's lots of tips and tricks that you can pick up along the way, and hopefully I can bring those to you guys in the coming videos. And speaking of new videos, let me know that you were here with a like. Leave me a comment if there's anything in particular you want to see, and please subscribe if you think you'd be interested in seeing tons more stuff from me. See you guys around.